Terence Washington stood before the terrified flight crew, their faces pale as he revealed his identity as the airline's new owner. "I want every single one of you to understand exactly why you're being fired today," he said, the memory of their discrimination still fresh in his mind. "Before we dive into this shocking story, where are you watching from today? Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications if you believe everyone deserves respect regardless of their appearance." The crew never expected what was coming next. The morning started like any other for Terence Washington. The soft beep of his alarm woke him at 5:30 in his penthouse apartment overlooking the city skyline. The 43-year-old tech CEO had built his software security company, Secure Tech Solutions, from nothing into a $4 billion enterprise over the past 15 years. His morning routine was precise, refined after years of discipline and success. Terence selected a charcoal Armani suit from his walk-in closet, paired it with a crisp white shirt and a deep blue tie. His watch, a limited edition Patek Philippe worth more than some cars, glinted in the morning light as he fastened it around his wrist. Success was evident in every detail of his life, from the marble countertops in his kitchen to the original artwork adorning his walls. His phone rang as he was preparing his morning espresso. The screen displayed Richard Bennett, COO. "Morning, Richard," Terence answered, his voice deep and authoritative. "Morning, boss. Just checking in before your flight. The investors are confirmed for 3 o'clock. They seem very interested in moving forward with the merger," Richard said. "Good. This meeting could push us into the European market months ahead of schedule," Terence replied, taking a sip of his espresso. "I'll review the presentation on the flight. And what about the North Star Airlines situation? Their stock dropped another 5% yesterday. Are we still considering the acquisition?" Terence gazed out his floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below. "Yes. Their infrastructure is solid, but their management is running them into the ground. Could be a perfect opportunity for us. I'll make a decision after this investor meeting." After ending the call, Terence checked his leather briefcase one final time. Inside were his laptop, tablet, the merger documents, and a folder containing preliminary information about North Star Airlines, a once prestigious carrier now struggling to stay afloat. As his private car service arrived at his building, Terence couldn't help but feel the familiar weight settle on his shoulders. Being a black man in the predominantly white corporate world meant always being conscious of how he presented himself. His father's words echoed in his mind. "You have to work twice as hard to get half as far." Throughout his career, he'd faced assumptions and prejudices, but had used them as fuel to drive himself forward, never allowing them to define his path. Arriving at the airport, Terence experienced the first hint of what would become a pattern. As his driver pulled up to the departures area, a parking attendant approached, waving dismissively. "Drop-offs only, buddy. You need to move your vehicle," the attendant said, not even glancing at Terence in the back seat. When Terence stepped out, dressed impeccably in his designer suit with his premium luggage, the attendant's expression shifted slightly, but he offered no apology for the assumption that Terence must have been the driver. Inside the terminal, Terence moved efficiently toward the priority security line, his first-class boarding pass and frequent flyer status allowing him expedited screening. Or at least, they should have. "Sir, I need to see your boarding pass again," the TSA agent said, scrutinizing the document with unusual intensity. "And could you step aside for additional screening?" Terence complied, watching as several white executives in similar attire passed through the regular security line without additional checks. The random selection felt anything but random. As the security officer patted him down and thoroughly inspected his carry-on items, Terence maintained his composed demeanor, a skill perfected through years of similar encounters. "Thank you for your cooperation, sir," the officer finally said, allowing him to gather his belongings. Terence merely nodded, knowing that showing any sign of frustration would only reinforce stereotypes about angry black men. Instead, he calmly reassembled his dignity along with his belongings and proceeded toward the first-class lounge. The day was just beginning, and he had a long journey ahead. The entrance to the North Star Airlines first-class lounge featured elegant frosted glass doors with the company's signature star logo. As Terence approached, he noted the attendant, a middle-aged woman with blonde hair styled in a tight bun, watching him with narrow eyes. Her name tag read, Pamela. "Membership card and boarding pass, please," she said, her tone notably cooler than the warm greetings she'd offered to passengers before him. Terence presented his platinum frequent flyer card and first-class boarding pass. Pamela examined them with exaggerated scrutiny, turning them over in her hands as if expecting to find evidence of forgery. "And may I see some ID as well?" she asked, not making eye contact. "Of course," Terence replied, maintaining his professional demeanor as he produced his driver's license. Pamela compared the license to his face for several uncomfortable seconds. "One moment, sir. I need to verify something." She picked up a phone, turning slightly away as she spoke in hushed tones to someone on the other end. While waiting, Terence noticed a white businessman who entered after him was welcomed with a smile and ushered through with only a cursory glance at his credentials. "Is there a problem?" Terence finally asked. "Just standard procedure, sir," Pamela replied, though her expression suggested otherwise. "Interesting. I fly this route twice monthly and have never been asked for additional verification before," Terence observed calmly. A man in line behind Terence, who had been watching the interaction, stepped forward. "I've never seen that standard procedure either, and I'm in this lounge weekly," he said. The man, who introduced himself as Brandon Clark, added, "Maybe your system is malfunctioning today." Pamela's cheeks flushed slightly. "The system seems to be working fine now. You're cleared to enter, Mr. Washington." As Terence and Brandon walked into the lounge together, Brandon shook his head. "That was completely inappropriate. Does that happen to you often?" "More often than it should," Terence replied. "But I've learned to document these incidents." He showed Brandon how he'd been recording the interaction on his phone, something he'd started doing years ago. "Smart," Brandon commented. "I'm heading to Chicago." "You?" "Same," Terence said. "Business meeting." They found seats in a quiet corner of the lounge, and Brandon, a marketing executive, shared his card. Their conversation shifted to business, and Terence found himself explaining some of his company's work without revealing his position. "We're actually looking at some acquisitions in the transportation sector," Terence mentioned casually. "Including airlines." "No kidding. Any specific carriers?" Terence smiled slightly. "Let's just say I'm very interested in understanding the customer service culture of certain airlines. It tells you a lot about a company's overall health." While speaking, Terence noticed a group of North Star flight attendants entering the lounge, presumably the crew for his upcoming flight. Their leader, a stern-looking woman with graying red hair, was speaking authoritatively to the others. Her name tag identified her as Margaret. "We're running a full first-class cabin today, so stay sharp," she was saying. "We've got some VIPs on the manifest." As Terence observed the crew, he noted how they interacted with various passengers in the lounge. Their attentiveness clearly varied depending on who they were addressing. A well-dressed white woman received immediate assistance with her request, while an Asian family was kept waiting for a simple question about boarding. "Interesting dynamic," Terence murmured, making mental notes. If his company proceeded with the North Star acquisition, understanding these patterns would be valuable. When boarding was announced, Terence bid farewell to Brandon and gathered his belongings. As he exited the lounge, he caught Margaret giving him a dismissive glance, clearly not identifying him as one of the VIPs she had mentioned. Little did she know, Terence wasn't just any passenger. He was potentially her future boss, and he was paying very close attention to everything happening around him. The patterns of behavior he was witnessing would factor significantly into his upcoming business decisions. He activated the recording app on his phone again, determined to document whatever came next. First-class passengers and our Diamond Elite members may now begin boarding, announced the gate agent, a young woman named Kelly with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Terrence stood and approached the priority boarding lane, boarding pass and ID in hand. Despite being directly in her line of sight, Kelly somehow managed to look past him, focusing instead on the white passengers gathering behind him. "Sir, we're currently boarding our first-class and Diamond Elite members only," Kelly said, her tone suggesting she was explaining something to a child. "I understand," Terrence replied calmly, sliding his first-class boarding pass across the counter. "I'm in seat 2A. Kelly's expression flickered with surprise before she composed herself. "Oh, I see. Yes, you can board." She scanned his pass without making eye contact, then immediately looked up with a genuine smile. "Mr. Fitzgerald, welcome aboard. We're so pleased to have you with us today." Terrence turned to see an older white man in a golf shirt and khakis being ushered ahead despite having arrived after him and despite Terrence already being in the process of boarding. As he entered the jet bridge, Terrence couldn't help but notice the pattern continuing. Have you ever been made to feel invisible despite standing right in front of someone? Comment number 1 if you've experienced this kind of treatment before, and don't forget to hit that like button if you're already invested in seeing where this story goes. On board, a flight attendant named Linda stood at the aircraft entrance, greeting passengers with practiced efficiency. When Terrence approached, her welcoming smile faltered slightly. "Welcome aboard," she said, her tone noticeably cooler. "Economy class is through though." "I'm in first class," Terrence interrupted politely, showing his boarding pass. "Seat 2A. Linda's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh. My apologies. First class is to your left." Terrence nodded and turned toward the first-class cabin. Behind him, he heard Linda warmly welcoming the next passenger, her tone markedly more enthusiastic than it had been with him. The first-class cabin was arranged in a 2x2 configuration, with wide, cream-colored leather seats. Terrence located 2A, a window seat, and was about to store his briefcase in the overhead compartment when another flight attendant approached. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his name tag identifying him as Mark. "There's been a slight change to your seat assignment. You're actually in 3B now." Terrence looked at his boarding pass again. "My boarding pass says 2A. "Yes, well, there's been a last-minute change. We had to accommodate some of our regular customers," Mark explained with an insincere smile. "I booked this specific seat 3 weeks ago," Terrence pointed out. "And I'm a frequent flyer with over 100,000 miles this year alone." Mark's smile tightened. "Sir, if you have an issue with your seat assignment, you're welcome to discuss it with the gate agent, but you'll need to exit the aircraft to do so. We're trying to maintain our departure schedule." Terrence knew this tactic well, forcing the choice between accepting unfair treatment or causing a scene that would likely be misinterpreted. He glanced around and noticed other passengers watching the interaction. Would they see a reasonable person being treated unjustly, or would they see confirmation of their prejudices? Is there a problem here? Margaret, the lead flight attendant he'd observed in the lounge, appeared beside Mark. "This gentleman is unhappy with his seat assignment," Mark explained, emphasizing "gentleman" in a way that suggested the opposite. Terrence maintained his composure. "I reserved seat 2A weeks ago. My boarding pass confirms this assignment. I'd like to understand why it's being changed at the last minute without any notification." Margaret glanced at his boarding pass. "I see. Well, sometimes these systems make errors. But I can assure you 3B is also a first-class seat." "It's a middle seat," Terrence pointed out. "I specifically booked a window." "Sir, we have a full flight today and many elite status passengers with specific needs," Margaret replied, her patience clearly wearing thin. "You're still getting first-class service. Now, if you could please take your assigned seat, we need to continue boarding." Feeling multiple sets of eyes on him, Terrence made a strategic decision. "I'll take seat 3B for now, but I'd like this situation documented." "Of course," Margaret replied dismissively, already turning her attention to other passengers. Terence stored his briefcase and took his new seat, a middle seat with a businessman in the aisle seat already occupied with his phone. The window seat on the other side remained conspicuously empty for several minutes until a white businessman boarded late and was warmly escorted to it by Linda. "Here's your seat, Mr. Peterson. So sorry for the confusion. Can I get you a pre-departure beverage?" she offered. The same courtesy had not been extended to Terence. As the boarding process continued, Terence observed the crew's interactions with other passengers. Their behavior followed a clear pattern: warm, attentive service to certain passengers, and cooler, more perfunctory treatment to others, particularly passengers of color. Have you ever noticed how some people are treated differently in service situations based on their appearance? Comment number 2 if you think what's happening to Terence is blatant discrimination, or number 3 if you think he might be overreacting. And if you're wondering what Terence might do about this treatment, you'll need to stay tuned for what happens next. The aircraft reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Almost immediately, Mark and Jennifer, another flight attendant, began the first-class beverage service. Terence observed as they started from the front, offering drinks and warm nuts to passengers in the first row. When they reached row 2, Jennifer smiled warmly at the passengers in 2A and 2B. "Would you care for champagne, wine, or perhaps a cocktail?" she asked, presenting a menu of premium options. The service continued to row 3, where Terence sat in the middle seat. When Jennifer reached him, her demeanor changed subtly. The menu of options wasn't presented. "Something to drink?" she asked curtly. "What are my options?" Terence inquired. Jennifer looked slightly annoyed at having to elaborate. "We have soda, juice, or water. I notice you're offering champagne and cocktails to other first-class passengers," Terence observed politely. Jennifer's lips tightened. "Those are for our regular premium customers." "I see," Terence replied. "In that case, I'll have a gin and tonic, please." Jennifer hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "I'll check if we have that available." She moved on to the next passenger without confirming his order. 10 minutes later, beverages had been served to every other passenger in first class, but Terence's drink was nowhere to be seen. Finally, Mark approached with a plastic cup containing a clear liquid and ice. "Your water, sir," he said, placing it on Terence's tray table. "I ordered a gin and tonic," Terence corrected him. Mark's expression was one of practiced confusion. "I was told you requested water. I apologize for the misunderstanding. I'll get that fixed right away." Another 15 minutes passed before Mark returned with a gin and tonic in a plastic cup, rather than the glassware being used for other first-class passengers. Terence noted the discrepancy but chose not to comment, instead documenting it mentally as another piece in the pattern of treatment. When meal service began, Terence was skipped entirely on the first pass. When he raised his hand to get Jennifer's attention, she nodded in acknowledgement but continued serving other passengers. It was only after everyone else in first class had been served that she approached him. "We're out of the beef option," she informed him. "You can have the pasta or nothing." "The pasta will be fine," Terence replied calmly, noting that he had seen beef meals being served to passengers seated after him. Throughout the meal service, Terence observed Mark and Jennifer whispering and occasionally glancing in his direction, followed by muffled laughter. Their behavior was subtle enough that most passengers wouldn't notice, but Terence had experienced this kind of treatment often enough to recognize it clearly. The businessman seated next to Terence, who introduced himself as Harold Grayson, seemed oblivious to the differential treatment. During their conversation, Terence learned that Harold worked in finance and was traveling to review potential investments. "What line of work are you in?" Harold asked between bites of his beef entree. "Technology and security," Terence replied. "My company develops enterprise security solutions." "Interesting field," Harold nodded. "Lots of growth potential there." You with a big firm? I own the company, Terence said simply. Secure Tech Solutions. Harold's eyebrows rose. Secure Tech? You're not, wait, are you Terence Washington? Terence nodded. Harold looked genuinely impressed. I've read about your company in Forbes. Didn't you just acquire that big data analytics firm last quarter? Yes, DataStream Analytics. They had technology we wanted to integrate into our security platform. Their conversation turned to business strategy and the current market climate. Harold mentioned the struggles of the airline industry, unaware of Terence's interest in Northstar specifically. These legacy carriers are dinosaurs, Harold commented. Their infrastructure costs are massive, and their customer service models are outdated. Some of them are ripe for disruption or acquisition. I agree, Terence replied thoughtfully. The right leadership could transform these companies. It's often not the business model that's failing, but the culture. Their conversation was interrupted when Terence decided to use the first-class lavatory. As he stood, Thomas, another flight attendant, approached him quickly. Sir, I believe the economy-class lavatories might be available, Thomas suggested with a pointed look. I'm in first class, Terence reminded him, gesturing to his seat. Yes, but the first-class lavatory is currently being used, and there might be a wait, Thomas explained. At that moment, the first-class lavatory door opened, and a passenger emerged. Terence raised an eyebrow at Thomas, who reluctantly stepped aside without comment. Upon returning to his seat, Terence overheard Margaret speaking to Jennifer in the galley, their voices just loud enough to be heard. Some people just don't know their place, Margaret was saying. Just because they can somehow afford a ticket doesn't mean they belong up here with our regular customers. Jennifer nodded in agreement. It's getting worse. They buy one first-class ticket and suddenly think they're entitled to the same treatment as people who actually earn their status. Terence discreetly took out his phone and activated the voice recorder, capturing their conversation. The discriminatory intent behind their words was thinly veiled at best. Their conversation shifted to discussing specific passengers, including the guy in 3B, who probably used points or got upgraded. The systemic nature of the discrimination was becoming increasingly evident. This wasn't simply poor service or a few isolated incidents. It was a pervasive attitude embedded in the crew's behavior and apparently tacitly approved by the airline's culture. 2 hours into the flight, Terence was reviewing his presentation on his tablet when Jennifer approached with the beverage cart for the second service. As she leaned over to serve the passenger across the aisle, her elbow accidentally knocked over Terence's water glass, spilling it directly onto his lap and expensive suit. The cold water soaked through his trousers immediately. Several droplets splashed onto his tablet, which he quickly wiped dry. Oh! Jennifer exclaimed with exaggerated surprise. I'm so sorry about that. Her tone suggested anything but genuine remorse. She handed Terence a single cocktail napkin, clearly insufficient for the amount of liquid spilled. Let me get you another water, she offered, making no real attempt to help clean up the spill. I need more napkins, Terence stated calmly but firmly. Of course, Jennifer replied, though she continued serving other passengers before returning with a few additional napkins, by which time the water had already soaked through to Terence's skin. The businessman beside him, Harold, looked sympathetic. That was clearly deliberate, he muttered, just loud enough for Terence to hear. I saw her do it. Terence thanked him for the observation, continuing to document the incident mentally. This latest action crossed the line from passive discrimination to active harassment. He decided it was time to address the situation directly. When Margaret walked through the cabin a few minutes later, Terence signaled for her attention. Excuse me, he said. I'd like to speak with you about the service I've received on this flight. Margaret's expression immediately turned defensive. Is there a problem, sir? Yes, there is, Terence replied, keeping his voice steady and professional. Since boarding, I've received substandard service compared to other first-class passengers. I was displaced from my assigned seat without explanation, skipped during initial beverage service, served in plastic rather than glassware, offered limited menu options, directed to economy lavatories despite being a first-class passenger, and now I've had water deliberately spilled on my suit with minimal assistance offered for cleanup. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Sir, I think you're misinterpreting normal service variations. Our crew is highly trained and would never deliberately provide inferior service to any passenger. Then how do you explain the fact that I'm the only first-class passenger who hasn't been addressed by name throughout the flight? Or that I overheard crew members making disparaging comments about passengers who don't belong in first class? Margaret's face flushed slightly. I don't know what you think you heard, but... I know exactly what I heard, Terence interrupted, his patience waning but his composure intact. And I've been documenting the differential treatment since boarding. Are you recording our crew? Margaret's voice rose slightly. That's against airline policy. Discriminating against passengers based on their race is against federal law, Terence countered. A few nearby passengers had begun to notice the conversation. One of them, a middle-aged white man seated across the aisle who had introduced himself earlier as Brian, spoke up. I've been watching this too, Brian said. This gentleman has been treated differently from the rest of us from the moment he boarded. Margaret's expression hardened. Sir, if you continue to disrupt this flight with unfounded accusations, I'll have no choice but to have security meet the aircraft upon arrival. Please do, Terence replied calmly. I welcome the opportunity to discuss this matter with airport authorities and airline management. You clearly don't understand how things work, Margaret said, her voice low and threatening. When it's your word against an entire flight crew, guess who the authorities believe? Terence met her gaze steadily. I understand exactly how things work. That's why I've been recording key interactions throughout this flight, which is perfectly legal in single-party consent states like the one we departed from and the one we're flying to. Margaret's confidence wavered visibly. You're recording right now? I am, Terence confirmed. And I've captured enough evidence of discriminatory treatment to make both the airline and the individual crew members liable. Jennifer and Mark, who had gathered nearby during the confrontation, exchanged worried glances. Other passengers had grown quiet, many openly watching the interaction now. This is ridiculous, Margaret declared, though her voice lacked its previous authority. You're creating a situation over standard service procedures. Standard procedures that somehow apply differently to me than to other first-class passengers. Terence questioned. I'm simply asking to be treated with the same respect and service level as everyone else in this cabin. The fact that this request is being met with hostility and threats rather than professional correction speaks volumes about the underlying issue. Margaret seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Finally, she said, I'll speak with the crew about your concerns, before retreating to the galley area, where she immediately engaged in intense whispered conversation with the other flight attendants. Harold leaned over to Terence. That took guts, he said quietly. Most people would have just endured it. That's exactly the problem, Terence replied. Too many people endure it, which allows it to continue. Sometimes you have to take a stand, even when it's uncomfortable. As the flight continued toward its destination, Terence noticed a distinct change in the crew's behavior. They now avoided interaction with him almost entirely, providing service with mechanical politeness when absolutely necessary. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted, with several passengers casting sympathetic glances his way or engaging him in supportive conversation. What none of the crew realized was that Terence Washington wasn't just any passenger making a complaint. He was a powerful businessman actively considering acquiring their airline, and he was learning far more about their company culture than they could possibly imagine. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent into Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, your tray tables are stowed, and your seat backs are in the upright position. The captain's announcement crackled through the cabin speakers. Margaret stood at the front of the first-class section, her eyes deliberately avoiding Terence as she performed the landing preparation checks. All electronic devices must be powered off completely at this time, she added, looking directly at Terence. Not just placed in airplane mode, but fully powered down. This instruction contradicted the airline's standard policy, which permitted devices to remain in airplane mode during landing. Terence noticed that no other passengers were being asked to fully power down their devices. Have you ever been singled out with different rules than everyone else around you? Comment number 1 if you've experienced targeted treatment like Terence is facing now. And if you're wondering whether he'll stand up for himself again or let it slide this time, make sure you've hit that like button and stay tuned to find out. As the aircraft touched down and taxied to the gate, another announcement came through: "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. For deplaning efficiency, we ask that you remain seated until the passengers in the rows ahead of you have exited. First-class passengers may deplane first." When the aircraft door opened, Margaret approached Terence's row. "Sir, we need to allow our premium passengers to deplane first. If you could wait until the cabin has cleared, that would be appreciated." "I am a first-class passenger," Terence stated firmly, gathering his briefcase. Margaret's lips thinned into a tight line. "Yes, but we have some VIPs who need priority deplaning." "That wasn't mentioned in the announcement," Terence pointed out. "The announcement stated that first-class passengers may deplane first, which includes me." Harold, still seated beside Terence, shook his head in disbelief. "This is getting ridiculous," he muttered. Terence stood, joining the line of first-class passengers moving toward the exit. Margaret looked like she wanted to physically block him but thought better of it. As Terence approached the aircraft door, he saw 2 airport security officers waiting in the jet bridge. "That's him," he heard Jennifer whisper to the officers. "The disruptive passenger we called about." Terence stepped into the jet bridge and addressed the officers directly. "Good afternoon, officers. I believe there's been a misunderstanding." One of the officers, a stern-looking man with graying hair at his temples, stepped forward. "Sir, we received a report about a passenger making threats and disrupting the flight crew's duties. We need you to come with us." "I made no threats," Terence replied calmly. "However, I did address discriminatory treatment by the flight crew. I have evidence of this treatment recorded on my phone." The second officer, younger with a more measured expression, asked, "Would you mind explaining the situation from your perspective?" Terence provided a concise summary of the events, from the seat reassignment to the spilled water to the crew's disparaging comments. He then played several of the recordings he had made, including Margaret and Jennifer's conversation about passengers who don't know their place and don't belong in first class. The officers exchanged glances, their demeanor shifting. Several other passengers who had witnessed the treatment stopped as they exited the aircraft, offering to corroborate Terence's account. "I've flown this route weekly for 3 years," said Brian, the passenger who had spoken up earlier. "What happened on this flight was clearly targeted harassment. I'd be willing to provide a statement if needed." The older officer nodded slowly. "Thank you for your cooperation, sir," he said to Terence. "Based on what we're hearing and seeing, there's no need for further security involvement. This appears to be a customer service issue, not a security threat." Margaret, who had been watching from the aircraft door, looked stricken. The other crew members gathered behind her, their expressions ranging from confusion to concern. Terence reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number and waited briefly before speaking. "Andrew? Terence Washington here. Yes, I've just landed in Chicago." He paused, listening. "Actually, that's why I'm calling. I've had quite an illuminating experience on one of your flights." Another pause. "Yes, that's right. Northstar Flight 1372. The blood drained from Margaret's face as she realized who she was hearing. Terence continued his conversation while walking toward the terminal, the crew still within earshot. It's given me a lot to think about regarding our discussions. I'd like to meet as soon as possible to review some aspects of the company culture before we proceed further. He listened again. Yes, I have very specific concerns about customer service standards and staff training. I've collected some rather compelling evidence today that I think the board should review. As Terence disappeared into the terminal, the flight crew remained frozen in place, the implications of what had just occurred slowly dawning on them. They had unwittingly discriminated against the very person who was considering buying their airline. Do you think the crew has any idea how serious the consequences of their actions might be? Comment number 2 if you believe they're about to face real consequences, or number 3 if you think they'll somehow escape accountability. The aftermath of this flight is just beginning to unfold. The North Star Airlines corporate headquarters occupied the top floors of a gleaming skyscraper in downtown Chicago. In the CEO's corner office, Andrew Harrison paced frantically, his normally confident demeanor replaced by barely contained panic. "What do you mean? Terence Washington was on one of our flights today," he demanded, his voice strained as he addressed his assistant via speakerphone. "Why wasn't I informed?" "His reservation was under T. Washington, sir," the assistant explained. "The system didn't flag him as a VIP because his profile wasn't linked to the SecureTech CEO profile in our database." Harrison ran a hand through his thinning hair. "And now he's saying he had some sort of negative experience." According to the preliminary report, there was an altercation between Mr. Washington and the flight crew. Airport security was called, but they determined there was no security threat. "Get me the lead flight attendant on the line immediately," Harrison ordered. "And find out where Washington is now. We need to contain this situation before it derails the entire acquisition." Harrison's mind raced back to the board meeting 3 weeks ago, when they had first discussed the potential sale to SecureTech Solutions. North Star Airlines had been struggling for years, losing market share to budget carriers while failing to compete with premium airlines on service quality. Their stock had plummeted 47% over the past 18 months, and bankruptcy loomed as a real possibility. SecureTech's interest had seemed like a miracle. The tech company was flush with cash and looking to diversify its portfolio. Terence Washington had expressed interest in the airline's routes and infrastructure, seeing potential where others saw only decline. The preliminary meetings had gone well, with Washington impressed by the company's technical operations and route network. But he specifically said he wanted to evaluate our customer experience personally before making a final decision, Harrison muttered to himself. "And we just failed that test spectacularly." His phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. "Harrison," he answered sharply. "Sir, I have Margaret Winters, the lead flight attendant from Flight 1372, on line 2, his assistant informed him. Harrison took a deep breath and pressed the button for line 2. "Ms. Winters, this is CEO Andrew Harrison. I understand there was an incident on your flight today involving a passenger named Terence Washington." "Yes, sir," Margaret replied, her voice noticeably nervous. "There was a gentleman who made some complaints about our service. We tried to address his concerns, but he became increasingly confrontational." "Confrontational how, exactly?" Harrison pressed. "He accused the crew of discrimination and claimed to be recording our interactions without consent," Margaret explained. "He disrupted our service routine and made other passengers uncomfortable." Harrison's grip on the phone tightened. "Ms. Winters, the passenger you're describing as confrontational, is the CEO of SecureTech Solutions and the potential buyer of North Star Airlines. He was likely on that flight specifically to evaluate our customer service standards." The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. "Did you know that we've been in acquisition talks with SecureTech for the past month?" Harrison continued. "Did you know that this deal could save our airline from bankruptcy and preserve thousands of jobs, including yours?" "No, sir," Margaret finally managed. "We had no idea who he was." "That's precisely the problem," Harrison said coldly. You shouldn't need to know someone's status or importance to treat them with basic dignity and respect. Sir, I assure you, we treat all our passengers with respect, Margaret protested weakly. Apparently not, since Mr. Washington has recordings that suggest otherwise. He's requested an emergency meeting with the board to discuss what he calls systemic issues with company culture before proceeding with any acquisition talks. Another stretch of silence followed. Ms. Winters, I need you and your entire crew to report to headquarters immediately. We need to understand exactly what happened and attempt to salvage this situation if possible. Yes, sir, Margaret responded, her voice barely above a whisper. Harrison ended the call and immediately dialed another number. Get me our legal team, he told his assistant. And clear my schedule for the rest of the day. This just became our top priority. Across town, in a luxury hotel suite, Terrence Washington was engaged in a video conference with his executive team. The large screen displayed the concerned faces of his COO Richard Bennett, their legal counsel Vanessa Chen, and PR director James Morris. The level of discrimination I experienced was beyond anything I expected, Terrence explained, having recounted the events of the flight in detail. And the most troubling part is how normalized it seemed. This wasn't just one prejudiced employee, it was systematic behavior across the entire crew. Do you have the recordings? Vanessa asked. Terrence nodded. Everything from the initial seat reassignment to the threats to have me removed by security. I also have contact information for several passengers who witnessed the behavior and offered to corroborate my account. This changes our acquisition strategy completely, Richard noted. The infrastructure and routes may be valuable, but the cultural issues run deeper than we anticipated. Complete reorganization would be necessary. I agree, Terrence said. But I'm also seeing an opportunity here. North Star is desperate for this deal to go through. We now have leverage to demand more comprehensive changes as a condition of the acquisition. What are you thinking? James asked. A complete overhaul of their training protocols, anti-bias education for all customer-facing staff, and removal of leadership that enables discriminatory practices, Terrence outlined. Including the crew from today's flight. Harrison has been calling non-stop, Richard mentioned. He's clearly in damage control mode. Let him sweat a little longer, Terrence decided. I want to meet with their board tomorrow. By then, word of this incident will have spread through their corporate grapevine. They'll understand just how serious this is. As they continued strategizing, Terrence's phone buzzed with a news alert. He glanced down to see a financial headline: North Star Airlines stock drops 8% on rumors of failed acquisition talks. News travels fast, he commented, showing the alert to his team. Looks like we have even more leverage than we thought. Meanwhile, back at North Star headquarters, the flight crew from Flight 1372 sat nervously in a conference room. Margaret, Jennifer, Mark, Thomas, and the other crew members exchanged worried glances as they waited for the meeting to begin. How bad is this going to be? Jennifer whispered to Margaret. I don't know, Margaret replied tensely. But Harrison sounded furious. How were we supposed to know who he was? Mark complained. He didn't look like a CEO. That's exactly the problem, Thomas said quietly. We judged him based on how he looked, not who he actually was. The door opened, and Andrew Harrison entered, followed by the airline's legal counsel and HR director. The expressions on their faces told the crew everything they needed to know about the severity of the situation. I've just received word that Mr. Washington has shared his recordings with members of our board, Harrison announced without preamble. I've also been informed that unless significant changes are made to our company culture, SecureTech will not only walk away from the acquisition but may pursue legal action for discrimination. The crew members paled collectively. Before we proceed further, I want to hear from each of you exactly what happened on that flight, Harrison continued. And I strongly suggest you be completely honest, because we already have Mr. Washington's documented account. As the questioning began, the crew members slowly realized the full magnitude of their actions and the potentially devastating consequences, not just for their own careers, but for the entire airline. The North Star Airlines boardroom exuded corporate wealth and power. Mahogany paneling lined the walls, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the Chicago skyline. Around the massive table sat 12 board members, their expressions ranging from concern to outright fear as they awaited the arrival of Terrence Washington. CEO Andrew Harrison stood at the head of the table, attempting to project confidence despite the crisis. "Gentlemen, ladies, I want to assure you that we're doing everything possible to salvage the SecureTech deal. Mr. Washington has agreed to meet with us, which is a positive sign." "A positive sign?" scoffed William Preston, the longest-serving board member. "The man was racially profiled and harassed on one of our flights while he was evaluating us for acquisition. I'd say we're lucky he's not simply walking away and filing a discrimination lawsuit. The stock has dropped 12% since yesterday," added Financial Director Elaine Chambers. "The market has already decided this deal is dead, and without it, our Q4 projections look disastrous." The room fell silent as the door opened and Terrence Washington entered, accompanied by his COO Richard Bennett and their legal counsel Vanessa Chen. Terrence was impeccably dressed in a fresh suit, his demeanor calm and professional despite being the center of attention. Harrison rushed forward, hand extended. "Mr. Washington, thank you for coming. We deeply regret the experience you had on our airline and are committed to addressing your concerns." Terrence shook his hand briefly but firmly. "I appreciate the opportunity to speak with the full board. What happened yesterday raises serious questions about North Star's company culture, questions that need to be answered before we can consider moving forward with any acquisition." Once everyone was seated, Terrence opened his laptop and connected it to the room's presentation system. "Before we begin discussions, I want to ensure we all have the same understanding of what transpired," he said. "With that in mind, I'd like to play some of the recordings from my flight yesterday." For the next 15 minutes, the boardroom was filled with the voices of North Star employees making disparaging comments, applying different standards based on perceived status, and openly discussing how certain passengers didn't belong in first class. The recordings were damning, leaving no room for interpretation or excuse. When the final recording ended, several board members looked physically ill. Harrison's face had lost all color. "As you can hear," Terrence continued, "this wasn't a case of minor service lapses or misunderstandings. This was systematic discrimination, apparently ingrained in your company culture to the point where your staff felt comfortable openly discussing it. Mr. Washington," Harrison began, "I want to assure you that this behavior is completely contrary to North Star's values and policies. The employees involved have been suspended pending termination, and we're prepared to offer you a formal apology along with appropriate compensation for your experience." Terrence raised a hand to stop him. "Mr. Harrison, this isn't about compensation or individual employees. What I experienced is symptomatic of deeper organizational issues. The crew felt comfortable with their behavior because they operated in an environment where such conduct was normalized and even rewarded." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below before turning back to face the board. "SecureTech is still interested in acquiring North Star Airlines," he stated, causing visible relief among the board members. "However, we have new non-negotiable conditions that must be met before we proceed." Richard distributed documents to each board member as Terrence outlined the terms. "First, we require a complete restructuring of North Star's customer service training programs, with mandatory anti-bias education for all staff. Second, we want a thorough audit of company policies and practices to identify and eliminate systemic discrimination. Third, we demand the immediate termination of the entire crew from yesterday's flight, along with any management personnel who enabled or encouraged such behavior." He paused, making eye contact with each board member in turn. "Finally, and most importantly, we require a change in leadership. Mr. Harrison, while I appreciate your damage control efforts, the fact remains that this culture developed under your watch. Our acquisition offer is contingent on your resignation and replacement with new leadership committed to transforming the company culture. The boardroom erupted in murmurs and exclamations. Harrison stood, his face flushed with anger. "That's completely unreasonable," he protested. "I've led this company for 8 years. These isolated incidents don't reflect my leadership or values." "If they were truly isolated, I might agree," Terrence replied calmly. "But my team has been researching North Star extensively in preparation for this acquisition. We've found dozens of complaints similar to my experience, many of which were dismissed or buried by your customer relations department. This isn't an isolated problem, it's a pattern." William Preston cleared his throat. "Mr. Washington makes valid points, Andrew. And given our financial position, we're not exactly negotiating from strength here. You can't seriously be considering this." Harrison looked around the table, finding little support in the faces of his board. "The alternative is bankruptcy within 6 months, Elaine Chambers pointed out. SecureTech's offer, even with these conditions, represents the best outcome for our shareholders, employees, and customers." After intense discussion, the board voted 7-5 to accept Terrence's conditions, including Harrison's removal. The CEO stormed out of the room, his career at North Star effectively over. Terrence and his team remained to discuss transition details with the board. As the meeting concluded, Preston approached Terrence privately. "That was ruthless but necessary," the older man acknowledged. "For what it's worth, many of us have been concerned about these issues for years but lacked the leverage to force meaningful change. Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to catalyze transformation," Terrence replied. "SecureTech isn't just buying your routes and aircraft. We're investing in the potential of what this airline could become with the right culture and leadership." As news of the conditional acquisition and leadership change spread through the company, reactions were mixed. Some employees worried about job security under new ownership, while others welcomed the promise of cultural transformation. In a conference room elsewhere in the building, Margaret and her crew waited anxiously for news of their fate. They had been sequestered since their arrival at headquarters, subjected to hours of questioning and review of the recorded evidence. "They can't fire all of us," Jennifer insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "The union won't allow it." "The union can't protect us from documented discrimination," Thomas replied soberly. "We crossed a line, and now we're paying the price." The door opened, and the HR director entered with several security personnel. Her expression was grave as she addressed the assembled crew. "As a result of your actions on Flight 1372 and the subsequent investigation, your employment with North Star Airlines is being terminated, effective immediately. You will be escorted to collect your personal belongings and then exit the building." Margaret stood, her face pale but defiant. "This is an overreaction to one passenger's complaints. We've all served this airline loyally for years." "This isn't about loyalty," the HR director replied firmly. "It's about integrity and basic human decency. The evidence clearly shows that you and your crew engaged in discriminatory behavior that violates not only company policy but federal law. You're fortunate that Mr. Washington has chosen not to pursue legal action against you individually." As security began escorting them out, Margaret made one last desperate attempt. "Can we at least speak to Mr. Washington? To apologize?" The HR director hesitated, then nodded. "He's actually requested to address all of you before you leave. You'll be taken to conference room B now." The crew exchanged nervous glances as they were led through the corridors. None of them knew what to expect from the man whose treatment at their hands had cost them their careers and potentially changed the entire trajectory of the airline. The tension in conference room B was palpable as the former flight crew filed in, escorted by security personnel. Margaret, Jennifer, Mark, Thomas, and the others took seats at the long table, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and resignation. They were no longer in their uniforms, having been instructed to change into civilian clothes before being escorted from the building. The door opened, and Terence Washington entered, accompanied by Richard Bennett and a woman they didn't recognize, who was introduced as Alicia Rodriguez, the interim CEO appointed by the board to replace Andrew Harrison. Terence took his position at the head of the table, surveying the crew who had treated him with such contempt just 24 hours earlier. "I imagine you're wondering why I wanted to speak with you," Terence began, his voice calm and measured. "It would have been easier for all of us if you were simply escorted out, your termination papers processed, and our paths never crossed again." He paused, looking each former crew member in the eye. "But that would be a missed opportunity. What happened on that flight wasn't just about me. It wasn't even just about you. It was about a culture that normalized discrimination to the point where you felt comfortable openly discussing which passengers belonged in first class based on their appearance." Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Mr. Washington, we want to apologize for any misunderstanding." Terence raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "This wasn't a misunderstanding, Ms. Winters. My experiences were recorded, corroborated by other passengers, and acknowledged by your colleagues. What I want to discuss isn't whether discrimination occurred, but why it occurred and what happens next." He gestured to Alicia Rodriguez, who stepped forward. "North Star Airlines is about to undergo a complete transformation," she explained. "Not just in ownership, but in culture, policies, and personnel. The behavior exhibited on yesterday's flight is a symptom of deeper issues that have been allowed to fester for too long. As of this morning," Terence continued, "Secure Tech Solutions has completed its acquisition of North Star Airlines. The company will be restructured from the ground up, with a renewed focus on equitable treatment and service excellence for all passengers." The former crew members exchanged glances, the full impact of the situation finally sinking in. They hadn't just lost their jobs, they had become the catalyst for the complete transformation of the airline they had served for years. "I want every single one of you to understand exactly why you're being fired today," Terence stated firmly. "Not because you failed to recognize a CEO or potential investor. Not because you cost the company an acquisition deal. You're being fired because you violated the fundamental principle of human dignity that should guide any service profession." He opened a folder and slid documents across the table. "These are the passenger complaints filed against this specific crew over the past year. 37 complaints, disproportionately from passengers of color or those with non-Anglo names. All of them describing similar patterns of differential treatment. All of them dismissed or buried by management." The crew members looked at the documents, some with surprise, others with resignation. "I could have simply walked away from this acquisition," Terence continued. "I could have filed discrimination complaints and let public opinion damage North Star's already fragile reputation. Instead, I chose to use this experience as leverage for meaningful change." Alicia stepped forward again. "Starting next week, North Star will implement comprehensive anti-bias training for all employees. We'll be establishing new service protocols with built-in accountability measures. And perhaps most importantly, we'll be creating an independent customer advocacy department with actual authority to address complaints and enforce consequences. Your termination isn't just punitive," Terence added. "It's a necessary first step in demonstrating that discriminatory behavior has real consequences. It sends a message throughout the organization that the culture of bias ends now." Jennifer, who had been the flight attendant who spilled water on Terence, spoke up with tears in her eyes. "We never thought of ourselves as racist. We were following the unwritten rules about which passengers deserved extra attention." "And that's precisely the problem," Terence replied. "Discrimination often doesn't present itself as overt hatred. It manifests in assumptions, in different standards of service, in split-second judgments about who belongs and who doesn't. Its power lies in its plausible deniability, in the ability to say, 'That's not what I meant,' or 'You're being too sensitive.'" He stood, signaling that the meeting was coming to a close. "I didn't ask to speak with you today to shame you. I wanted you to understand that your actions, while damaging on a personal level, have inadvertently created an opportunity for systemic change. Your departure makes room for employees who will uphold the values of dignity and respect that should have been non-negotiable all along. As the former crew was escorted out, Terence turned to Alicia. Ensure that the press release emphasizes the positive changes coming to Northstar, not just the terminations. This needs to be about moving forward, not just punishing past behavior. Alicia nodded. The board has unanimously approved your proposal for the Customer Advocacy Department. We're already receiving applications from industry professionals excited about the new direction. 6 months later, Terence stood in the newly redesigned Northstar Airlines terminal at O'Hare, observing the transformed operation. The airline had been rebranded with a new logo and color scheme, symbolic of its internal transformation. Staff uniforms now featured a subtle equal sign woven into the design, a reminder of the company's commitment to equitable treatment. Boarding a Northstar flight for a business trip, Terence was greeted by a diverse flight crew led by a black woman captain. The first-class cabin was staffed by professionals who provided exceptional service to all passengers, regardless of appearance or background. As he settled into his seat, Terence reflected on the journey that had brought him here. What had begun as a routine business trip marred by discrimination had evolved into an opportunity to reshape an entire company culture. The transformation wasn't merely cosmetic, passenger satisfaction scores had risen dramatically, employee retention had improved, and the airline was on track to return to profitability ahead of schedule. Sometimes, he thought, the most powerful response to discrimination wasn't simply to call it out, but to use one's position and influence to create systemic change. By converting an experience of bias into a catalyst for transformation, he had turned an injustice into an opportunity for progress that would benefit countless passengers and employees for years to come. Terence Washington's journey reveals several profound truths about confronting discrimination. First, documentation is power, recording evidence prevented denial and gaslighting. Second, speaking up calmly but firmly is essential, even when it's uncomfortable. Silence perpetuates injustice. The story also illustrates how discrimination often operates subtly through differential treatment rather than overt hostility. The flight crew didn't use slurs or refuse service completely, they simply provided noticeably worse service based on appearance and assumptions. Perhaps most importantly, this story demonstrates the difference between individual complaints and systemic change. Instead of just seeking personal compensation, Terence leveraged his position to transform an entire company culture. He recognized that true justice isn't just punishing wrongdoers but creating systems where such behavior becomes unacceptable. For those without Terence's resources, the lesson remains valuable: document incidents, know your rights, and whenever possible, push for structural changes rather than individual exceptions. The most powerful response to discrimination isn't just resistance, it's transformation. Have you ever experienced or witnessed discrimination in a service setting? How did you respond? Drop a comment below sharing your story or thoughts on how Terence handled the situation. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about overcoming injustice. Share this with someone who needs to understand the impact of everyday discrimination and how change is possible. Thank you for watching, and remember, your voice matters in creating a more equitable world.